Okay, fantastic. So, as soon as you start sharing, Gordon, over to yourself, and please take it away.
Sorry, you're saying screen sharing is disabled.
Okay, let me just see if I can add you. I did message you. I think it might be the same because we've let me have a look, Gordon. Oh, there's two. Yeah.
I was on my phone earlier.
All right. Okay. Cool. I'm giving you every kind of permission under the sun. So hopefully, if you try now, hopefully you'll be able to share.
Right. Okay, here we go. Why is this not? Okay, should see the screen now. I'm Gordon Guthrie. I'm a research fellow at Scottish Government, and this is the results of my research programme. This sounds absolutely terrible. Right, is that better? Yeah. First thing is, the opinions are mine. They're not Scottish Government, so everything you see here is independent research. What I've been doing is a practitioner-led systemic review of the end-to-end political and legislative and delivery cycle. And I'm trying to institutionalize best practice and figure out how, what's missing and how we get world-class digital systems. My background's a bit odd. To trade, I'm a software engineer. I've been coding since the 70s, worked in Silicon Valley, and I'm end up at VP engineering. In another life, I've been a parliamentary candidate a couple of times for a couple of parliaments, and I've also worked in public policy. So I'm quite happy in multiple roles and looking at different stuff. Here I'm talking about better government, and it really is, I'm going to define what I mean by better. If we look at the policy scissors, we have policy intent, which is what the government intends to happen, and policy effect, which is what actually happens. And in the context of better government, we're talking about closing these scissors. Is this very echoey for people? Because it's quite echoey for me.
A little, but it's okay.
Okay. When we think of that, essentially, the intent is what the political leadership want to do. The effect is what actually is delivered, and the challenge is linking these. And if we look at traditional public sector reform, it tends to focus on something that is done to the civil service by the political class. And I'm very aware that this is a crazy process. If you go back to the 1990s, I'm working on the campaign that becomes the Yes Yes campaign, and friends of mine design parliamentary process for the Scottish Parliament. And so we know that the Parliament passes laws and generates computer systems as a causal relationship. But we also know that no consideration of that was put into parliamentary process, right? Because go and ask your friends and say, when you designed parliamentary process, it really wasn't a consideration. There was a consideration of using technology to allow people to participate in seeing the parliament working, but not in actually doing the work. One of the reasons is, although we're talking about better government, there is another generic thing that we care about a lot, which is error compounding. If the design process starts way back in manifestos before legislation, then fixing errors at that stage is going to be a lot cheaper than waiting for a bill to be passed and then told, oh, it doesn't work. So a chunk of this is looking around that total cycle. So in this review process, I've interviewed 60 or 70 people. I've probably talked to another couple of hundred in workshops. In Scotland, I've done literally hand to hand. So I talked to people who designed manifestos, then into the programme for government, people who write bill packs, parliamentary clerks, opposition MSPs, and then techies, designers, developers, right the way around to in-service. So about two-thirds of my reviews in Scotland end-to-end, and then the other third has been mostly Whitehall, but some France, some New Zealand, some Canadians, some people who've got interesting things to say. And when we talk about optimising this process, we got some hard constraints. The Scottish Parliament does 22 bills a year, 400 ministerial orders, and recommendations must cover new deliveries, but also existing systems. And critically, there can't be technocratic answers. There has to be a separation of powers. So I'm going to sort of jump to some of the conclusions now. And there's three major programs. They're all quite tightly coupled. The first one, which should make a lot of sense to people on this call, is just earlier an integrated design. So there's a training program for people writing bill packs in Scotland that about 250 people do a year. So that's the English equivalent would be about 2,500 civil servants a year go through this training. And they have lectures from all sorts of people, not techies, but the recurring thing from the people who are ancillary involved is speak to us earlier. Speak to us earlier. The process of creating a bill is defined in a handbook, a bill handbook. There's a Scottish one, there's a Welsh one, there's a Westminster, there's a Northern Ireland one. They're about 400 to 500 pages long, and they don't mention technology at all. So one of the core things is saying, how do we get integration of delivery and design teams into the policy team at the beginning? How do we get consideration of reuse existing data into that policy design? How do we do policy and design iteration before parliamentary process? And what steps can we put in place to make sure this happens? So some of this stuff is about training, changing the training program. So it now tells people, have you spoken to the designers? Have you spoken to the data people? Are you going to reuse? Some of it is fixing issues by putting simple things in the bill pack. So when a bill is introduced, it comes with about 8 or 9 documents. There's part of it is the justiciable part, which is the bill itself and the explanatory notes. Those two with the transcript of the parliamentary debate under Pepper v. Hart, which is a legal ruling, can be interpreted by a judge when making sense of the law, the text of the law. There's a second set of things in the bill pack, human rights. I mean, the bill pack is different in Scotland as Westminster, but in Scotland you have human rights, regulation, island communities. There was going to be UN Treaty on the Child, but that got blocked. So there's a series of things where there are external constraints on the legislation, and the minister declares we've done the work to satisfy ourselves they meet those constraints. It doesn't mean that in a court case they couldn't be found not to meet the constraints, but they declare the work has been done. And the third part is the charismatic part of the bill part. So this would be the financial memorandum, where the minister says it's going to cost 100 million. And that's just the ministers, saying if it costs less than 100 million, I'm a hero. If it costs more than 100 million, call for my resignation. So what proposing is to put in that bill pack some, as part of the charismatic part, some declarations. We have talked to the data people. We have done pre-design. We have considered component reuse at a system level. So payment rails, communication rails, various other aspects, single sign-on that we want to do. So this first part really is about, it's interesting when you do a skills comparison between Silicon Valley tech firms and government delivery, there's no skills gap. There's nothing that's done in the private sector that isn't done in government. There are, however, a number of things that are basically being done out of sequence. So decisions are made upstream in the build process, and then people at the back end are left trying to catch up with. So a lot of this is about addressing those kind of issues. The second major program addresses iterative design that we know is a first class. We know it ought to be a first class property for large projects. Everyone believes now in iteration. Now, we have a sort of myth of legislation as a point in time process. So the king summons the three estates, the barons, the prelates and the burgesses. They meet in Dunfermline or Scone or Holyrood Palace or Lithgow. They're a council or a parliament or whatever. They then debate for 3 days and vote acts in totality or in block. Well, that hasn't happened for 30 years for major digital programs. If you look at this graph, I've taken universal credit and Scottish Social Security, and I'm plotting the number of pieces of legislation over time. So this is this is secondary legislation. So, since the Welfare Reform Bill was laid in 2011, there's 240 pieces of legislation. Scottish Security has shown a difference. So we know that the process of specifying a major system is a continuous and not a discrete process. And yet legislatively, this is broken into primary acts where the Parliament has a major role in debating them, and secondary orders where the Parliament has almost no role whatsoever. So there's a sort of constitutional problem. There are a number of different ways we could move towards a more iterative process. We could formally define bills as alpha, beta, gamma bills and get power to build a prototype and then power to expand that and power and come back to the Parliament for approval. We can use a variant on a Framework Act. At the moment, the current Framework Act, all the subsequent work is done under secondary legislation, but we could have a Framework Act with a common stage 1, which is the Scottish equivalent of, or the English equivalent of this is first reading. So the general principle has been agreed by the Parliament, and then we come back for detailed debate on the follow-ups. We ideally could move towards a more co-working, co-design approach. There is a constitutional problem with co-design because the principle is that the government consults and then proposes with the bill. The Parliament consults and then disposes, gives permission. And with co-design, the government then says, oh, now we're going to go off and design it. And it's like, well, Parliament's supposed to have the last thing. So if we're interested in proper co-design and co-production with citizens, that also has to be co-working, co-design with Parliament. And we need to be able to take the lessons that have been learned and put them through a formal parliamentary process. Now, I've skipped through that in 2 seconds. There is a working paper. I put a link to this drive in the chat earlier. Throughout the process, I've been working in public, so I've written a lot of working papers, and I've given you a link to all of them. So this particular one specifically looks at designing a legislative process that can deliver major digital programs, and it works against a range of outcomes that we need. Now, since parliaments do work, they weren't designed to create major digital programs, but they do. So there is a functioning system there. The assumption behind this is that were we to try and design a process to do that, we would get better results. And looking at the patchy record of major IT systems, I'm fairly confident this is a good idea. Now, the Scottish security system learned a lot of the UC lessons, and I go through that in the paper. I talk about the lessons were learned, and but there's some, I think, interesting ways to do that. The third major program arises really from the only genuine insight this research has brought up. If we look at the hygiene cycle, and that is effectively me playing back all the complaints that practitioners like yourself have, because if there's nobody on this call who has never said they spoke to us too late, I'll be astonishingly surprised. And when you look across different disciplines, the data people, analytics reporting, content organizers, service designers, the same issue comes up again. But with this one, really, this sort of came out from detailed research. The state doesn't have institutions to manage non-functional requirements, and non-functionals include joined up government and data sharing. And the reason for this is that law itself only specifies functional requirements. And I'll go into a bit what I mean by functional and non-functionals. It's slightly old-fashioned technology trade terms. If you're a young thruster who uses AWS or Google Cloud or Heroku, mostly they do a lot of your non-functionals for you. But if you're a pensioner from the age of mainframes like me, this was quite an important distinction. And critically, the failure to manage the non-functionals is why we end up with siloed systems. So to try and make it a bit more tangible, the functional requirement is what the system does, and the non-functional requirement is what is required in the background, so foundational things. So in this case, water must come out the tap, it's a functional requirement, but the non-functional requirements are aqueducts, reservoirs, mains water. So you can satisfy the functional requirement by putting a rain butt on the roof and connecting it to the tap, but you ain't going to get world-class water coming out your taps. So how do we get here? We can anachronistically go back to the 1950s and imagine building a social security system. I mean, it did happen, but the non-functional functional technology, terminology wasn't used. So the functionals are very similar. You design forms, you have algorithms to perform calculations, you request information. And the non-functionals in the 1950s were a building in a town with enough people to hire. It must have electricity, and electricity isn't red for a reason. I'm going to step you through that. And you come to the current day, and we suddenly get a whole load of new non-functionals. Staff have to sign on, databases back up, stuff. And the functional requirements tweak slightly. We go from paper forms to digital forms, and the key thing though is these two sets of non-functional requirements. The old-fashioned ones are decoupled. And if you look at legislation, there's a section, there would be a section that says create a social security agency, and it has the ability to go off and hire people, set up a building. And then it would have a separate section that actually ran through the functionals. So this is the information, these are algorithms, this is what you have to do. But in the current world, our new non-functionals are baked into our functional systems. We've got to write this code. And if we don't have any management of that, then each team goes off and does their own thing. And then that's why data sharing and joint governance starts failing. Now, electricity is quite interesting because electricity is a post-digital non-functional. When I put on my laptops in my new social security building, my desktop computers, I've got 230 volt AC on my desk, and I've got a requirement for 12 volt DC on my motherboard. And how did I make these two things come together? Well, I just plug my kit in. And the reason I'm able to do that is because electricity is specified by standards. And so standards are a first-class mechanism for coordination without communication. Nobody in the new Scottish Security Agency phoned up to understand what electricity was required, right? The building people didn't phone, the desktop suppliers didn't phone. All of them knew what to do without communicating. It's not specified in the legislation. It's not specified in contracts, I don't imagine. When you buy a computer, it's completely communication free coordination. And we can literally measure that. So this graph, I take 79 pieces of Scottish social security legislation, 3 primary acts and 76 secondary acts. I break them down into sections. So the legislation is parts and schedules, which are organizational, like folders. And then within them, the next layer is sections and subsections and subsections. And I read all of this, and I looked at a section, and I said, do I got to write any code here? And if the answer is no, it's a non-specification. And if the answer is yes, it's a specification. And then I look at the spec and I say, is it a functional or non-functional? And what we see with this orange line is the functionality being specified. And at the bottom, there's 2 lines for 2 classes of non-functional specification. An endo non-functional, which says this is how a particular piece of social security software must work with other pieces of social security software. And an exo one, which says this is how the social security system must talk to other government systems. And basically there's practically nothing that's non-functional. So we have a purely functional specification of the law. And the practical implication of this is you have a Social Security Committee, which is functional, facing off against a Social Security Minister, which is a functional title, who has written and implemented a Social Security bill, which is functional, has appointed a senior responsible officer whose job is to deliver the functionality in a Department of Social Security, which is a functional unit. And then on the non-functional side, you got nothing, right? So your functional requirements are must-haves because they're in the law, and your non-functional requirements are nice-to-haves. So whenever you get a problem, you do the must-haves, and so we basically drive into silos. And it's interesting when we talk about Estonia, our Estonian equivalents have a shared non-functional requirement up that stack. It's shared by opposition, parliamentarians, government ministers, civil servants. And that non-functional requirement is when the Russians come. When the Russians come over the border, the entire Estonian state goes into exile, goes into the cloud, continues working, continues operating when the state is occupied by the Russians. And so whenever the Estonians have the arguments that we have, you can always push back and say, well, I have to do this because when the Russians come. Whereas here we lose that argument consistently. So I'm going to whip through the recommendations here. I've shown the 3 programs, but they kind of tie in with each other. There's 33 of them. They apply to different parts of the process. A lot of them are around supporting the program for government. It looks here like I'm proposing 5 acts of parliament. I'm proposing 5 enactments, which may end up being 1 or 2 acts. And they cover a whole range of stuff. I can't really go through them all. As I say, there's lots of working papers. There's looking at componentization that Vicky was talking about earlier. Working paper 3 might be of interest to people, which is looking about componentization, but looking at both design components, components realized as code, components realized as services like common payment services and single sign-on, components realized in legislation. So if you have a licensing software platform, can you design legislative templates such that new licenses, when they come through Parliament, are automatically implementable without rework? And then there's a whole chunk of stuff around modular description of data powers. That's also covered late in law reform for data, which is looking at having a standard way of describing data powers and ability to share data. Other ones are more or less relevant to designers, but never mind. So at the heart of this is putting in some institutional changes. If we look at the last complex technology, which was nuclear power, in 1946, we get the Nuclear Materials Act, which says the Minister of Supply controls anything that glows in the dark. This was quite unsuitable. So in the 50s, we get the Atomic Energy Authority, which is an expert body that separates the minister from control of nuclear power. And then in the 60s, we get the creation of an inspectorate whose job is to keep an eye on the AEA. Because it's bombs, these 2 parties are on the same side. But if we look at an institutional model in the Scottish Parliament. On the government side, we have the Law Commission, which can propose new legislation. It's a government creature. And on the parliamentary side, we have a couple of oversight bodies. We have Audit Scotland, which can pester you about money, and we have Social Security Commission, which for Social Security legislation acts as a pre-checker before the Parliament. It's the Parliament's technical wing for Social Security. So in this world, I'm proposing a digital reform office, which rhymes with the Law Commission, and a digital auditing and scrutiny commission, which has both the proactive audit function and also the reactive scrutiny function for things that relate to major digital systems. And it's quite important to this as well, because when we look at the original programme, there's a whole load of stuff that goes through the legislative programme, Social Security, but there are a number of systems that have no legislative basis. So single sign-on, UK Gov payment rails, these are not statutory systems. And because they're not statutory, they don't have a parliamentary direct oversight on them. And yet they're major institutional and infrastructural work that will be influencing the state for 50 or 100 years. So I'm proposing that the Scottish equivalents be put under the same scrutiny of a parliamentary committee. The Scrutiny Commission, I think, needs to be like the Atomic Energy Authority. So techies, but wrapped in legal, ethical wrap. So it's not tech bros. It's got to be understanding how technology influences society. And Digital Reform Office should be located at the very top level of the civil service. And these should be seen as the professional heads of the trades. And if you read Local Government Reform for fun, you'll know the Haldane Commission in 1918, you'll know the Fulton Commission in the 1960s, you'll have read Francis Mauld's recent report. The same thing comes up again and again and again. How do you develop and maintain your technical skills and rise to the top of the civil service? So this ladder is very much part of that. I'm now going to, it's a range of parliamentary process that needs to be knit in, and this is very Hollywood specific. So Westminster doesn't work like this. So there are two sources of legislation at Holyrood: the government and parliamentary committees. That's three. And the Law Commission can also propose bills, but the government must adopt them. So I'm proposing that the DRO can propose bills, but they require government adoption. And on the secondary legislation side, Westminster has 17, 18 different types of secondary legislation. Scotland has less. Basically got the standard negative affirmative and super affirmative. Social Security bill goes through a special review thing, and I'm really just proposing that the digital ones follow the Social Security review model. And the key thing is the DRO needs to be a parliament of standards. It was interesting, if you're as old as I am, I saw the professional community of been described as an assembly of web designers. The 1979 referendum proposed creating a Scottish Assembly. Well, Edward Heath's Perth Declaration of 1969-70 proposed an assembly, and the Welsh Parliament originally was called an assembly. So my answer to people who set up this new assembly of web designers is, call yourself a parliament, you cowards. Right. So we know in the internet that decentralization and autonomy is driven by centralized standards. So you have this dumbbell where you try and standardize the smallest number of things to enable the maximum amount of autonomy. And so we want the DRO to work on other parts of the Scottish Civil Service in a similar way. So the challenge then is to have a centralized body that can issue standards and maximize autonomy and decentralization. So I'm not recommending an organization like GOV.UK, which has become more centralized than I would have liked. And the challenge again is to make one end of the dumbbell as small as possible and the other end as large. So really focus on innovation. The key and recurring problem, and it came up in the man from Bumble's presentation. We all know within our professions the importance of standards. We all know how to create them. And we all know there's a recurring problem in making people comply with them. And because we haven't substantially institutionalized the creation of standards, a lot of the time, standards compliance is determined by charisma of a senior person, ministerial backing, or various things. So we need to move that over to an institutional basis where there is a sort of legal requirement to follow them. And this has been done by Ontario Digital Services. The process of setting up, sorry, not Ontario, Ottawa Digital Services. ODS was set up. A lot of the consultation work was done with Tom Loosemore and people who'd worked at GDS. And the Deputy Minister Digital, which is the senior civil servant in Canada. So the senior civil servant in digital in Ottawa can issue standards which civil servants are obliged to follow. So you have the ability to compel coming from within the technical community. When I talk of a parliament of standards, that's exactly what I mean. A parliament is a body that creates maximum consensus and loser consent. And the characteristics of the parliament are determined by the constituents. So in the 1300s in Scotland, it was the burgesses, the prelates, and the barons. Obviously, that becomes property owners in the 1800s. It becomes returned servicemen and older women in the 1918. It becomes empire citizens in 1929. And then more recently in Scotland and Wales, we have a parliament of residents. If you're in Scotland, whether you're a citizen or not, you get the vote. So in this world, the constituents of the Parliament of Standards are the technical trades. And that parliament sits underneath the democratic parliament supervision. But the job is the same. And it's a kind of sheepdog model. In 3 years' time, I need you to go through this gate, but each of the sheep decide how they get there and go under the road. So it's not a command and control central management model at all. What I'm proposing is that we build these institutions iteratively. The Scottish Parliament has, we can build prototypes by seconding people, by using existing powers of committees in the Scottish Parliament, because the standing orders allow committees to bring on external people. There's an experimental mechanism in the standing orders for temporary standing orders, and we can then run this new processes for a single bill. So the rest of Parliament continues working 21 bills in the old way, one in the new way. And then because the committees have the right to write legislation, the parliamentary committee can both draft new standing orders, procedures, and also write the legislation to create the institutions. So you have mechanisms for making constitutional change that already exist. At Westminster, this would be slightly harder. Yes, so that's been a fairly violent ride through. Like I say, here's the link to the thing with all the working papers again. I'm going to put my camera off because this is terrible. Okay. Sorry, I haven't been following your messages because I'm on the web.
Okay.
Let's have a quick look at these messages. Yes, somebody's saying they haven't heard non-functional since, yes. You're showing your age now, Caroline. You must be like me. Accessibility and usability, they have been. Some have been pushed into the law. Well, let's go to questions. Any questions?
First of all, thank you, Gordon. That was a really, really informative talk.
It's slightly a bit of away from a working designer, but it's trying to apply systems design to ourselves at that sort of high level, and a lot of things that particularly about standardization. So the working paper on Lego components talks about this, where we first of all standardize within our zone of control, and we build components with what we can do, and then we have to promote that component thinking, and we see that in the design world, where the components that Vicky showed us started off as a set of guidelines. So start off by following these guidelines, and now it's design. Here's the code that pre-embodies those principles. And I think we need to see that process continuing up into legislation as well. So saying to people that don't design a payment system, use this one, is the incorporation of what originally would have been how to design a good payment system, and then a payment system, and now just plug and play.
Thanks for those extra comments. Caroline, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi. I thought I'd oh, sorry, I'm getting an echo. I think it was very fascinating to have a view from a very different angle on the work that we all do, so much appreciated. From my very specialist point of view, one of the things that I find is a lot of this stuff is designed at the legislative stage with very little understanding of what the current picture is of what they're actually trying to alter. There's very little investigation, for example. So there'll be things like, well, you have to digitize this form without any consideration about whether that form is packed with errors and creating a lot of cost. Do you think that any kind of investigation can get built in, or as we'd call it perhaps these days in GDS terms, discovery? Or am I just being naive about what our sort of modern iterative ideas might help us with?
Yeah, there's a big chunk of stuff based on, well, kind of related to some of the register work that GDS brought in, which has all failed. So we need to have a register of services. We need to have a register of powers. So we can say this is a legal power that the system's under, and the services should self-declare their data, so we can navigate that against standards. And then one of the other things we need to do is start integrating how we're going to measure outcomes with policy, and start pushing discovery and reuse much more into the pre-legislative part. But at the moment, we don't really have, I mean, we don't have a register of services. So when you say, let's understand the current world, well, we don't even have a map of that. So putting some of that stuff in place is critical. The other thing is that where you have legislative constraints on digitization at the moment, you now have to put a bid through probably a departmental bid for legislative time, which then has to go into whatever the Westminster equivalent of the programme for government is. One of the working papers is an enabling act and the power of the Digital Reform Office to promote its own bill. And so you then basically shortcut out some of that departmental stuff and go and attack barriers to good digital, wet signatures and stuff. And the experience from Ottawa was, I think they had to change 100 primary bills in their first year. So if you get stuck in that, I mean, it's Brexit traffic jams, but for what you need done legislatively. So yeah, I do think I do really want discovery based upon published evidence and knowledge to be at the heart of pre-legislative thinking. These opinions are not the opinions of Scottish Government.
Love that disclaimer right at the end there. Were there any more comments or questions for Gordon before we give him a round of applause? I think that's it. So take yourselves off mute if you prefer to do an actual hand clap, or let's just show our appreciation for Gordon and that fantastic talk. It was a really interesting, and as Caroline alluded to, it's a different perspective on things that we all work on. So thank you so much, Gordon, and really nice to see the latter part of your journey as you've done more research. So very, very much appreciate that. We have a break now until 4 o'clock, but please do come back at 4. We've got some very short closing remarks and an exciting announcement. Dangling that out there to draw you back in. And then we've got a short retro. Tam, I'm not sure if you've got the link. Do you want to post the link to the retro in case people want to get started early and start thinking about any feedback that they might have? Obviously, your feedback is very, very valuable. We plan to run many, many more events, and the more feedback we get about what you need, what you liked, what you'd like to see, the better we can make these events going forward. So with that being said, I'm going to let everyone get off, and hopefully we will see you back here at 4 o'clock. And if you want to get started a bit early on that retro, or just have a peek at the questions, the link is in the chat. Thanks, everyone. See you at 4 o'clock.